there is a way you live inside of literature, and I'm been much more influenced by literature than reality. One of the great ghost stories, and this is a literary ghost story, written by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, and one of the things he said is something doesn't have to exist to be real.
Identify your general why. Why do you want that? Because you want to be more loving, you want to just be more giving and more uplifting. If you want knowledge, go to school. If you want truth and beauty, follow me. Mary Shelley to Beatrice. Now join us into a beautiful journey of beauty, love, life, and all its beauties and tragedies that it has to offer. Who is the author of more than 19 books, mostly fiction. He is also a professor and now joins me on the podcast, and I'm so thrilled. So join us on this beautiful journey to discuss his book, Awake Forever in a Sweet Unrest. Welcome. I'm Yanik, your host, and now joining me, Dr. Chuck Rosenthal, the author of Awake Forever in a Sweet Unrest, published by Walton Well Press in September the 5th, 2024. Welcome, Dr. Chuck Rosenthal, to the show. It's such a gift, and what a book you have written. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I love that quote too, because I know plenty about going to school and knowledge, and I know plenty about walking away from it. Uh, there's you know sometimes big differences between what's real and what's existent. I know that one of the great ghost stories, and this is a literary ghost story, written by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, and one of the things he said is something doesn't have to exist to be real, and and I think that says it for this story, because there's so many impossible events, as you say, and certainly uh, Coleridge's trip with Beatrice, my main character, Beatrice, who is with a Z, but not like Dante's Beatrice, and not like Dante Alighieri's Beatrice either. But people ask her all the time if she's read Dante, and she hasn't. But she's a high school dropout. She's hasn't read much of anything yet, and that makes her, in some ways, a perfect literary foil for these gorgeous writers and adventurous uh, men and women. Mary Shelley, who wrote the fantastic novel Frankenstein. So they know, and I hope I know too, because things I've written a lot, as you say, I've written a lot of books, and things really came together in this book, and I studied these people assiduously, their work and their biographies, um, until I felt like I could sit in a room with them and converse. But Beatrice does it instead.
This is beautiful. So, before we really dive into the book, I want to give our listeners and readers a taste. Who is Chuck Rosenthal? And if you want to give it a go, tell us who Chuck Rosenthal is in only one sentence, and then talk about your interesting biography, because I really truly love it. You have been also a former cowboy and then ultimately switched to professor and now successful writer. And just a little bit about myself, my dream was always being basically a cowboy when I was a little boy. And I always, envision myself living one day in the United States of America and literally being a cowboy. So to me, it's actually very special. I haven't realized it yet, but the fact that you were a former cowboy is just really, really appealing to me, and it's just lovely. So
Well, I
please talk a little bit about your past and how you ultimately became a professor at Loyola Marymount University in California.
well, when I was a child, I inherited my big sister's tricycle. It was probably about, I don't know, foot tall, and my parents put a saddle on the seat and a horse's head on the handlebars. So they must have known something. And I lived in the center of a city, a small city, Erie, Pennsylvania, um, but the center of a city. So I just was drawn to horses. And speaking of that, the issue of truth and beauty, I was a professor when I got my horse actually, and it became a passion for me. And it's a long story how I ended up at age 45 getting a horse, but I did, and that horse taught me so much about communication and discipline and learning and love. Uh, so I didn't have to turn from cowboy to professor. Now I learned to do a lot of physical things. I learned how to rope off horseback, um, and chase animals, animals, other horses mostly. I wasn't chasing cows, but uh, most of it I learned training, and I had a wonderful trainer and a very difficult horse, and that absorbed me intellectually. So as a writer, it really fed me. In fact, I eventually, after she died, which broke my heart, I wrote a novel about her, mostly from her point of view, called 10,000 Heavens. Um, so that transition wasn't difficult. I I left college and went to graduate school in philosophy, and I got an MA in philosophy, and then I went and pursued a PhD. Um, and I found, and I think philosophy found about me that I was less interested in discussing findings of philosophy. In fact, I believe that, as I suppose Wittgenstein already had done, that it was metaphor, and a number of people that were looking for the truth in philosophy, and that's not where you go uh, for the truth. So eventually, when it came down to my dissertation, and I wanted to do it on animal intelligence, symbolic communication in non-human animals, they said no. So I left, for a brief time, I went back to Erie and I'll collect garbage and help run a boys and girls club, and uh, and then I started writing and began writing. But I read voraciously, so that's and I picked up I think it's the Long and Beatty anthology of American literature, and I started at the beginning and I read it. And every time I came to a novelist, say Jameson or Cooper or Hawthorne, I would read all their novels, um, Melville. Um, so a lot of Faulkner. I didn't get all the way through all of Faulkner, but anyways, this so that. Uh, but what really turned my head in terms of the romanticism, because you've asked me, I know in some of your questioning points about Keats, it was Kerouac who was a romantic writer, a very right, rabidly romantic writer. But and I read all of Kerouac, and he's not such a great poet, but he's a great lyrical writer, and that I think made me susceptible to to what happened in to writing. But again, I wrote. I'm always a romantic writer. Although all my novels are magical and and romantic. I'm going for some essential things. I I did not believe that language was a mirror or a window to the world. The language was some way of making metaphors about the world. Um, and so there's the truth. And Keats and I eventually in 2011, I I was in England teaching at the Imperial College, and had just come off radiation in the states for cancer, and I was up. I couldn't sleep very well at night, and I would pour myself a glass of port and stare out this big bay window with the double decker buses going by and read Blake. I was reading Blake, and it really. I said, "Wow, okay, here's a visionary." And when I got back to the states, I was writing other novels at the time, but my life partner, um, who's a poet, said to me, "You want to read the Romantics?" And she went up to her office and came down and gave me a stack of Byron, Keats, and Shelley, and I started uh, reading them, and then I got interested in their biographies. And I'm not necessarily enjoy biographies, although I've read a few now. Uh, and he said, "I have to write about these people, but I don't want to write." Again, I left academy. I mean, I did get a PhD in literature, um, but I didn't like writing papers about people I wanted to create, and so I wanted to write a book about these romantics, um, John Keats, Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and but how to do it, and but I've had a lot of experience about the kind of characters I needed, and I knew I needed when I started to write. Beatrice was somewhat older, and I didn't want an educated person. I wanted a young person, and these people were really young at the time at their peak, on the in the teens, 18 teens. They were in their 20s, um, and uh, and writing like crazy, and doing a lot of things like crazy. But that's when I discovered Beatrice, and she became, in some ways, right, not a, the, like Beatrice's guide to Dante, but Mary Shelley becomes Beatrice's, right, guide to this world. So, um, and I didn't worry about time travel. I didn't worry about it. I just went there,
This is what I love
and
so much because to me, that's truly time travel, and that's truly basically the legacy and the gift of humanity. And that's, you can also call it basically the spirit that everyone will always, in some way or another, in one way or another, be present, whether it's just in our memories or by, by their legacies, such as their books. And that you actually did this and you recognize these giants, Byron, Keats, Shelley, and write about them in such a poignant way is really touching, because you touch here on something that really goes to the very core of being human. And I want to know your take on that. But it almost seems to me that you felt like that philosophy doesn't necessarily still the thirst that you have for the truth, and that there is something more to it, and that has to do more with a story, with metaphors that go beyond language, in the sense of really truly capturing life, and the truth is ultimately beyond language, is somehow what even Young also called it, the unconscious, when it comes to dreams, right? dreams, they talk to us in pictures. That's a different knowledge, it's a different way of communication, but it is most likely, especially in my view, it is also the truth, just at a different level. And I think oftentimes we underestimate the importance of these different levels of truth, right? Because there is just something that goes beyond our cognitive ability, especially language. Therefore, we have this tacit knowledge. Sometimes we just know this is true, even though we do not have the words to actually express it, right? It's the same thing as we can never really describe love, right? Because it escapes ultimately the confines of language. So, is this somehow accurate how I depict your transition from philosophy to really becoming a fiction writer?
I really learned who these people were. I live with a poet who says it's the job of poetry to express the inexpressible, to discover words. And Keats said that he's how his job as the poet to lift the veil of reality, right, and ordinary language to show the truth and the beauty underneath. Well, that's what he did. And in this bunch of writers, I think in some ways he lyrically, in terms of some of his lines, did it the best. And although I really enjoyed Shelley and I enjoyed Byron, Don Juan just me up. I loved it. Um, so that's what I try to do. And the other what's the other idea, right, for Keats? And this is again this it seems like almost anti-knowledge, right, to talk about negative capability, but no, that's that lifting away those conventions of the real and of language and lift it to see underneath it. And he certainly did that. And Coleridge helped him actually. He said he took a walk with Coleridge, down 2 hour walk with Coleridge that changed his life. Um, and so I'm thinking Coleridge was semi sober at the time, but I don't know. Um, but I don't have a how to do it. Um, I I have faith in myself. I've worked hard with the discipline of writing narrative and no, just being able to get to a character and put them on the page and allow them. And so I sat with their poems at my feet. I sat in my chair. I didn't work at a desk for this, with a notebook and a pencil, and I had their poems laying at my feet and their biographies, and I did to pick these spots because they had both, right? They all had long, complicated lives. So I did have to pick the spots that that Beatrice, the main character, was going to step into. And her first trip around with them, she sees, right, each of them two times, not counting the cremation at the end. Um, and One, she steps into that fantastic life of Keats, and that fantastic life of Shelley walking across France, uh, and of course the beauty and power of Byron. But her second time through, she's dealing with their deaths, and this is not a pessimistic book, but I mean, we almost die, and she's is stepping into that time of their deaths and how they're willing to deal with death, and that's a really uh, a step, a breakthrough. Talking about Freud and Jung. I read much more Freud than I did Jung, but I read the interpretation of dreams. Um, and I studied Freud pretty closely because I studied with a professor who studied under Derrida, and Derrida was tremendously influenced by Freud. Um, so I know about dreams. The other thing that you brought up, which is right, is about thinking in pictures or thinking in images. And I know in the second half of the 20th century, between scientific behaviorism and structuralism and post-structuralism, the emphasis was so totally on language, as if humans lived in language. And in fact, we live in pictures as well. They're going on in there all the time, but I think we've been taught to ignore them, uh, you know, recently. And so I'm really dedicated to the image. And I think that's part of the lyricism of this book is that I think all of these stories that Beatrice enters um, have to do with powerful characters and powerful imagery, and uh, and things happen. You know, it's as well. I'm a storyteller, and I'm willing to let anything drop by to do the story, to get to the story, and don't let anything get in the way. Not anything ideas I want to get across, not ideas anybody wants to get across. It's not about communicating ideas. And we're back to what you've said before about truth and beauty, and getting there with imagery. Uh,
And this is
well,
really also
it's
what
exciting. You want to find out what happens next, which is a very unusual thing for a literary ghost story.
we will dive into the book a little bit later, but I just want to unpack a little bit this powerful book, and I want to know your take on imagination, story, and the importance of it in order to live fully. I think what your book also does, it truly puts you into a completely different world that activates just different parts of the brain that might have been neglected over, at least in my life, over the past few months. And so it's really time traveling. And I'm curious about, how do you think important imagination and fiction and stories are in order for us to live a meaningful life in general? What is your take on the importance of helping people to imagine a story in their heads?
Well, one of the things that you asked in your early notes about addressing was the where inspiration, and a lot of people have been asking me because I've been doing these interviews now for a bit about where ideas come from, and well, that I made a joke once and said, well, they come from outer space, but they don't. They there is a way you live inside of literature, and I'm been much more influenced by literature than reality. Again, and the beautiful ways it's portrayed. I'm sometimes writers like Saramago and Bolaño and Aira. I guess they're not Americans mostly, right? They're European and South Americans, but they live in that world of creativity and imagination, and that's where I'm inspired. I try to read. I read sometimes 4, 5, 6 books at once. Everywhere, the place I can sit, there's a book, and I let myself be inspired, and I let myself discover and say, well, if if Flaubert was in the same situation right now as say Beatrice was in, or where I'm in, what would they have them say? How would they approach this situation? And I run it through my mind, and and it's not simply sitting around and things happening to you. Um, I live with these characters and their stories, and they talk to each other, and I run through the scenes, um, and I don't accept logical movement in their thought or their dialogue. They express these agendas, and so I'm rejecting a lot of stuff before I come to the page. Now, after the page, you have to get rid of things too. But so that's that's how I do it. I don't just sit around thinking imaginative thoughts. but I've read so many situations, and a lot of that has occurred in right epical literature, say, uh, right, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. Um, these amazing stories with full the 100,000 nights and one night. I mean, these tropes have been used a long time, and I feel like I have them in my hands, and that can and just put them down there. Besides, you can always get rid of it. You keep right. You keep what's good. It's not just a simple explosion. God bless Jack Kerouac, but it's not. Well, I'm quite a bit older than Jack Kerouac. I didn't have that access to some of maybe the things I did, but so now one of the things that goes on right here is the question of, and for Beatrice, is how much of this is dream, and which you brought up, and but it doesn't really. It does occur in imagery, but it's not like surrealism. It right. These things, these are real people. She can touch them and feel them, and even in some cases make love to them. So it's, but she is living in a completely alternative world, and when she returns to the present, her present, she's in wonderment, and about which world is more real, and certainly that happens to us in dreams, right? And sometimes the event and we know we're dreaming, but it's still it's still completely real. So I don't know. It's Jung. I don't know. I wasn't really consciously working archetypes um, in this book, but I'm sure that they're in there. Uh,
But what I also love is that, because you alluded to precisely that Mary Shelley basically tells Beatrice that, well, the question is, well, if she a ghost? Well, the question is, are you a
right,
ghost? So there's this really interesting
right.
exchange, where, who is actually the ghost? Like, that's a really good question. We don't really know, because we might just live at different, parallel universe or whatever it is, right? And therefore the question of reality becomes very much real, right? And I think it's just so rewarding to read that, but also it opens us up to a whole new horizon of what's actually truth, and how we act to live our life. So give us a taste on how you interpret that, and the importance of this scene at the very beginning, when she actually went down to the library and she was actually told that she has to close the door behind herself, otherwise she won't have
Yes,
access anymore.
yes. She has to close the door on that world. And Keats says to her. Keats calls her. Even though I think one of the last things he says, he calls to her. He kisses her forehead and calls her his ghost from the future. Um, so there's that belief that he expresses that there are the ways that lives cross, and it has nothing to do with chronology or time. It's just the meeting of these interiors, um, and that's miraculous. But that's what happens. That's what happens, and it's it was fascinating because Mary Shelley, of course, obviously has to navigate that, and she has to be looking back into a past. But once time she tells Beatrice, right? Well, Beatrice says, "Why don't you remember me?" And Mary says, "How could I remember you? You didn't exist yet. It was 200 years before you." Um, so I enjoyed playing with that, and not trying to have a time machine or means of traveling in time. Again, it's it's happening metaphorically, but that happens right very in a very real way. These are real characters who live and uh, party and hunt and I see that they themselves see ghosts. Right? She enters that the ruins of that convent. Beatrice does with right Keats, and they see ghosts. They see ghosts together. They're standing there, knowing which one of them are ghosts, and they're seeing other ghosts. Um, and
And I also see
I
there
kind of got
actually
again that comes from. Go ahead. Yes.
I also see there to some extent a cultural critique. What you also allude to is that we should never ever judge the past with the standards of today, in some ways, because as they met 200 years later, you know, earlier, she said, right, well, how can I know you? Because I can't, right? So there is also this respect of actually time, and every place and time has its specific context that we cannot somehow just juxtapose with each other with today and the past, right? So you also show a lot of humility in terms of what means to be human.
Well, and that's what it means to be human is an interesting point because there's one person beyond that who we haven't talked about yet, and that is the fictional creation of Mary Shelley. That's the Frankenstein monster, and exists on a right another completely different level, but exists really, and becomes a threat and wants to die, and he's constructed from these body parts that were once dead, and now they're put together, and he can't kill them, and in some ways right it, well, he protects her in when during Keats's prize fight, and she doesn't know really recognize that that's Frankenstein. But he was an astute reader by his description, the scars in his neck and on his hands, right, would pick up that would be the Frankenstein monster. He does, but he appears 200 years later on the bulldozer that's going to bury that library that she's visiting, and that is kind of the if there's I don't even think the book has a climax, but it must have a half a dozen denouements, um, ways in which it ends. Her father dies, and then she's visited by the Frankenstein monster who holds the original first edition of the book, in which he's created. Um, so, but I learned a lot from magical writers. Marquez would be another one, and I guess
I want to
so.
know,
Hmm.
in terms
did I
of
did I did I
yourself.
did it come anywhere near your question? I'm sorry.
No, no, very, very good. Actually, I really appreciate your elaboration on the process and really the story itself, because there's so much that you can unpack. It's so deep that I can really tell it's a masterpiece. And what I also appreciate is actually it's 84, 89 um, pages, but it
Eight
feels
pages,
like,
89 pages. It turned out.
yes, it's so powerful, so concise, so profound. And I want to know, in terms of you, how you think about this beyond, besides the book. Do you personally believe in ghost or in a reality that is beyond our physical existence?
I guess I might say I always call myself a polyagnostic, um, and when it comes to religious ontology, I've studied a lot of religion. I'm really fascinated by it, um, but um, I have ghosts in my house, but I don't know if I don't know what to think about them because they're right, and that's another right, I guess, example of these romantic ghosts is they do things like knock or appear as shadows, and I don't know what to do with it. So I don't have an ontology in which ghosts exist. So I don't believe in necessarily in another world. Um, Although certainly I talk to it, not around anybody else. I don't, but and then I again, when I'm inside these novels, I live in those worlds. I live in those worlds, and and there's the example of things that are real that may not exist, but they're very real. Um, so so and that's how I approach time travel too. Um, because if you try to get into the mechanics and the right the of what it could take to travel in time, you're just not going to get there. And it's if you try to make up some world in which time travel exists, you're in more trouble than ever. But there's this again this intersection of memories, an intersection of lives, and different and layers. And this book wonderfully just right the more I went on, the thicker it got. The levels just kept kept building, and the questions kept coming. And again, I wrote about 200 handwritten pages and thought, well, okay, that's a good sized book. And then when I typed it up, it was like 130 pages. And then when they printed it, it was 89. I said, well, so I didn't train myself to write a concise book, although I have training in that regard. I was educated in graduate school in the minimalist era, um, which I'm not a minimalist. I'm not a realist, right? I'm not a poet. I'm not a historian. Um, I'm not a biographer. I'm not a scholar. Um, I'm a fiction writer. I'm a storyteller, although a sophisticated one, I hope. And but this book really unfolded. It's the shortest book I've ever written, and it took me the longest time to write it. I followed a kind of Hemingway practices. I never finished a scene without starting another one or a chapter without moving forward. Always move forward. Um, always move forward, and because you can always come back. You can always, and I take the craft part of it and tell myself I'm practice. This is practice. I'm not writing the greatest thing in the world. I'm practicing writing the greatest thing I can possibly write. Um, and I feel with this book I did. All those things came together. The time and the layering, and and the imagination and the fantastic fantasticism, fantasy of it. Uh, yeah.
But you also actually make the case based on your book, but also on what you're telling me is really that reality and imagination are intrinsically actually linked, because everything there is has first and foremost be conceived in our minds, right? And ultimately, it's created by hands. And so uh, I want to know your take on that, but I think really reality is as much what we have, in other words, our thoughts, whether you want to call them ghosts or not, but there is always something that is somehow animated behind the scene that ultimately allows itself to manifest in the empirical reality. That, so it's measurable. If it's measurable, it's science. If it's not measurable, it's not science. In this sense, I mean empirical. And on the other hand, there is this other view of science, which is indigenous based science, which is really, if it's relational, it's science. If it's not relational, it's not science. And that's really ultimately also what really today quantum physics tells us, right? And so to me, just to come back to this, what we have discussed, this form of if literature is reality or not, to me, I think it is a precursor of reality. I think there is something that needs to be explored that helps us to understand more deeply who we are, in order to ultimately also experience the empirical reality, but also the reality that we create within us somehow, uh, to get an understanding of the two. So my point is simply that literature or your imagination or fiction is simply another form of reality. What's your take on this proposition?
Well, I I can I firmly believe that I mean every moment can become a moment of imagination, and it is again Keats' negative capability is letting that stuff letting that drop away, um, and waiting for what's in there. And if you have enough, I think just it has to do with again experience, and for me, lit, literature to fill my life with those things. And I know I don't know I used to know a lot about photography, and actually, and I do keep up uh, with quantum mechanics and those things. A good friend of mine was one of the inventors of the laser. He died of COVID. Um, and it was Bob Hell, which is very. So I, I kind of know the physics, but I don't know the math. But I know the discussion. So, and I know how imaginative that is. And if you are right, we are keeping up now. We know that all of our concepts of the universe and what are the things that create this um, thing that we say we experience reality. All of that's coming apart. We don't know what's going on underneath, and we don't know what's going on around us in terms of how to explain what's here, which is and if what's here is almost impossible, well, that's pretty. And I don't know. I don't attribute it to some necessarily some being who guides this and creates it, and we exist in that being's imagination. Um, Lots of people have said that, right? I guess maybe even starting possibly Plato or Plotinus or move move forward. And actually Coleridge is a good example of that. In some ways, he right he misreads Kant, and I don't want to go in that direction, but to find that the imagination is everything in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, uh, and he right was on opium and woke up and wrote down right Kubla Khan. Um, and in fact, right, Beatrice goes to Xanadu with somebody who might be Coleridge and he might not be, right? And she goes in his tent. Um, so it's pretty this reality stuff is pretty tenuous, but it's also very important and dangerous because the world particularly right as you know here in America is violent and threatening. Um, and frightening. I mean, I'm sitting here right now waiting to be evacuated from a wind event and potential wildfire. So that's okay. That's real, uh, I guess. Uh, but where do you go with that? And I've been in wildfires and written about them several times, and that's pretty fantastic stuff. Uh, but I don't know. I keep
No, that's wonderful. It's just such a gift, to talk to you, Dr. Rosenthal. I just want to go a little bit back to your youth and talk about more about imagination. So when you look back on your career, what you have done, what you have written so far, and what you have really experienced in your life, were there any moments in your life when you were an elementary student or a high school student or a college student that you were somehow imagining in one way or another the life that you have now and that you went through?
well. I think I wrote my first short story in third grade. It was an act of imagination. It was about riding the first filly to win the Kentucky Derby. Uh, and then in high school, I wrote several novellas, hand wrote them behind the student in front of me's back, um, and they were all imagination. They were all allegory. Um, I guess I was a kid. I read comic books. I read had the I had the first Fantastic Four and the first Spider Man and all those things. But those things are they were kind of flat for me. My imagination was a little more explosive, and I was constantly creating other worlds. Sometimes they were simple worlds like sports worlds and inventing games. My father used to say you could put me in a sandbox with a couple of clothespins and leave me alone for hours. So I don't know. Maybe so. I guess that was my imagination operating, but I never was self conscious about it. I never saw myself as as that imaginative, or even um, as an artist. I didn't start really considering myself an artist until I don't know, maybe a decade ago. I just thought I was a writer, but in fact, I'm an artist, and that's a realization that it liberates you. You don't. It liberates you, and so I guess I've been practicing for a long time, uh, and in college. So in high school and college, I kind of decided I had to get serious, and I studied history and philosophy and some literature because I thought I might have to go out and do something uh, with myself, and I found that landscaping and collecting garbage were not how I wanted to spend my time. Um, but but again, eventually, I had to wander away from that, and I don't know. I wrote three rather unimaginative novels until I finally wrote my first published novel, Loop's Progress, which was the first creative dissertation as uh, published in the United States. Um, I imagine there's lots of them now because there's so many schools, so many MFA programs and PhD programs. But so I let myself follow the path, and I didn't let discouragement or the inability to get, say, published stop me from writing the next book. Okay, I'll write the next book. What world can I enter? And I've always found one. I'm looking for it now, and I just fell on an idea a couple nights ago. But after doing a lot of different research, so and let it happen. Just try to not impose myself again on the world, not try to impose my a philosophy. Or obviously, I have politics and I have uh, uh, and I guess philosophical positions. But again, I'm listening. I'm
And
listening,
this
and
really comes truly
I'm
true in
reading,
your book.
and not try to pay attention. Uh,
I think the world will be
uh,
so much better off if we will be better listeners. And I want to touch on 2 points that you mentioned again, and tell us what you mean by the difference of being an artist and an author. And also, I'm wondering, to what do you attribute this imaginary ability that somehow came natural to you in your childhood? To what do you attribute this? Were your parents somehow very helpful in order that they gave you somehow space where you could really explore yourself, your surrounding, but also really your imagination?
my I was brought up working class, um, so and very working class. There were eight of us there, and four brothers lived in a tiny room with no closet and only one light bulb and no heat in Erie, Pennsylvania. My my mother was very disciplined and rejected, did not want to be a house person. And in fact, when my youngest brother finally went to kindergarten, she went back to work and was very successful, became a very successful executive for the Catholic Church, which I'm not a Catholic. My father was not. My father was extremely artistic. He has a beautiful voice. He played the guitar and sang. He sculpted out of clay. He uh, he drew. Um, he and he had calligraphy, practiced calligraphy. But he was deftly anti-intellectual. He did not. And my mother was an intellectual, and my mother was very disciplined, and that was something I came. I think the combination here. It's not. You just can't. Let your imagination run. You've got to practice the discipline of fielding it and expressing it and finding a way for it for it to finding a way. So I had a couple of brothers who were one is a musician in Manhattan now, younger than me, and another one younger than me who, like my father, right, became a painter, and he paints. He's got a studio in New York, in Queens, I think. So something was brewing in there, in that family, and I was never discouraged, and I think that's really important. I know a lot of people I talk to about it. They talk about because you have a child and you decide how to respond to the world, and they said, well, their parents would always, when they come in get in trouble with authority, their parents would always side with authority. My parents never sided with authority; they always sided with their child, um, and that's I think gave me confidence, and they were just my mother was very supportive of accomplishment, and um, and to pass that on, we have a daughter who left the United States, has been in Australia for 15 years, and she's a performer and has made a living as a performer. So that's in there. Um, I don't know how much has to do with me. I'm not a performer, but I do. I'm performing on the page. I think that's an act of uh, performance, and I did. It's not so. Well, there's that act of creativity, right? There's that initial moment that you put that down. You finally have those ideas, and you organize this world, and you know these people, and you put them in situations, and you've got to, right. Um, and that's the spontaneous side of it. But the other side of it is then to study it and look at it and say, what have I done? What have I done? How can I do it better? And to continue doing it. So it's just not rampant creativity. I think it's a combination of creativity and discipline. Um, and then I don't know, something. It's there's a lot of baloney in here, a lot of silly stuff that just nags you, and you need to just, as Keats might say, set it aside. And you could, if you're a Buddhist, you could turn it into a discipline of setting it aside all the time, continually setting that kind of stuff aside. But the more you can do that, then the more you can allow those, I think, imaginative elements to find their way in. Um, so,
I love what you said because you
but
really
I don't know.
remember.
I can't. I don't have any arrows to say. Well, this happened. It made me do this, and this happened. It made me do that. Um, but
But I think
Yeah,
it's it's
but
really because I have.
I do have a relationship with a marvelous poet, and again I thought that and I had a horse that changed my life, and that's an interesting thing to have happen to you.
But I'm also really curious
Motorcycle
about.
too,
Yeah, but something I think it's really
and
important
I
what
came
you're
here and I learned to
mentioning.
surf.
Oh, nice. Oh, beautiful. That's you mentioned about discipline, but also about your parents being so supportive. In other words, they were always siding ultimately with you. And I had actually the same experience with my parents. They were always supporting me when I got in trouble in school and so on. They didn't blame the teachers or the principals, of course not, but they were always rock solid there and showed me that, hey, they are behind me and they help me, and no matter what. And so this really helped also myself to have a certain level of just confidence, that really helps you go and move forward in life. And I think if you don't have that necessarily, it can be brutal for a child, and ultimately it translates into your adulthood, right? Which can have huge implication if it's not addressed. So I think you make a very good point, and it's not about uh, spoiling the children at all, but it's giving them a basic certainty of security, of connectedness, recognition, action, which ultimately results into creativity. In doing so, meaning can be created, and therefore there is more likely that you are somehow um, well-rounded human being, because you are not preoccupied with the fundamentals such as security, such as, you're all constantly worrying that your family might leave you and then you are alone uh, in this world. So I think that's a really important point. So how do you see that? um, I think that was huge, really, to for you to develop as ultimately an artist. And I'm just curious how you made this separation. When did you, and what was the moment when you realized, hey, I'm actually an artist, not a writer? So what changed in your life when you realized, hey, I am an artist rather than a writer?
Yeah, I'm more able to accept my faults and my fears, um, and know that those are just important as things to encounter, and not be constantly seeking satisfaction or and joy. Although I'm big on joy. I try to let it happen as often as I can. Um, so, but and I don't think it was a cataclysmic change. It just uh, became slowly realization that, oh well, I'm not I, okay, we're all unique. I know, uh, and but that I can exploit my uniqueness and accept it. I found out later in my life that I am on the spectrum, so I have a certain characteristics that people used I don't know, they used to call it Asperger, but they don't anymore. But the way I concentrate, and I can come into, say, if I'm in a social situation, I could not even know what's going on. But also sometimes I can perceive with acuity when people are being false and they say one thing and mean another, and people that are more adept socially don't seem to notice that, and I do. So that's a peculiar talent that I learned to accept and learn to express, and not worry about the deficiencies that are developed. Uh, but to, to go with that, to, to go with whatever my misperceptions may be true, um, and 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 let that happen. So I think that was a change. I think, and I became less and less self-conscious about manipulating the world on the page, and then again being able to go back and look at it and see, okay, what did you do, and how do I make it? How do you make it better, and how do consolidate it? Uh, and I loved the book Awake Forever and A Sweet Unrest, because it it does that so efficiently. We've talked about. I know it's remarkable. But that happens in here. My commitment there. You move from one scene to the next very smoothly, radical changes, and no apologies. You just move. I just move. I go. I don't worry about explaining it. I don't worry about how, um, when Beatrice and Mary climb a ladder in the library and they end up on a ship. That's what happens. Now we're on a ship, right? And
But
that
this is
that
the beauty that is
confidence
so
is,
powerful,
I think,
because you give the reader really the power of seeking and making meaning, right? In this very powerful way that you don't really explain it, but you go on. So it's really on the reader to make meaning out of it. And I think that makes the story so powerful and so participatory.
yeah. I just finished an essay by Virginia Woolf, who again I read all of her most of her work. Um, who said it's the job of the reader to permit themselves to try to understand what the author's doing. Don't be making judgments. Uh, and but so that the act of reading is as creative. And this is not new, right? This is it's the '70s. Stanley Fish, among others, right? Reader response. But the reader is an active participant um, in the book. And how do you let that happen? With and you do it with specificity, right? Uh, they their minds can go to work with that specificity in front of them. I think it's just give that world. Let them they can draw their own conclusions from the right if they're an astute reader. And some readers are more astute than others. But uh, what I've found so far is that there are people that know the romantics and have been able to enjoy this book, and people that don't know them at all. And in fact, I didn't know them very well when this started. I was not a poet, and I didn't study poetry much in school. I mean, did the basics, like Shakespeare and Robert Frost, and everything. And but I didn't encounter them much, and then I encountered this world, these people, and just opened up to it. Just get it, let it, keep till I could, I could sit down and have some wine with Shelley and Byron and Keats and Mary Shelley. If I chose, I could hold conversation with them because I don't know if I knew more about their lives than I knew about each other's lives, but Byron and Shelley were very close, right? And then and antagonistically close. Um, so that was fun too. Uh, and Keats was so marvelously in his own lyrical world. So and then and Mary was in there commenting. Of course, they were all dead when she started writing like Shelley's introductions to Shelley's poems, and reading them very differently than what he. If you read like what he said he was doing, and you read what she says he did, they're different. They're different. I haven't got the specificity in here that I can pick out an example of that, but so that there is that, and Mary Shelley's even says, maybe on a couple occasions, the last person you want to ask about uh, a poem or a story is the author, because too they're too full of their own meaning, and they're not right. They can't see it. They can't see what's in right what they did, and of course you try to get there. You try to practice where the point where you can see what you did, but I don't
I'm just
know.
I'm just reading one line, and Keith said this, and I want you to comment on it because it really goes to our last topic about beauty, truth, and love. And Keats, he said this: I am emptying my heart, so you and angels may enter. Please comment.
Well, that's what he tried to do. right? And that's what he does for her, and that's what I mean. This right because this book is a there's a way in which Beatrice is proxy for the reader, and as she is discovering, you are discovering, uh, and let's see, what do we what? Oh, about emptying. Yeah, emptying his heart so she can step through, or an angel can step through. I mean,
Exactly.
that's a major theme of the whole book, right? Is and she's constantly letting these people step through. She's learning about them and who they are, and she's stepping into her life. And this is a right rite de passage, or a you know a life about her life changing and her becoming an adult in these 89 pages, coming from a relatively not innocent, because obviously she's done drugs and had sex, but moving from that naivete to a certain level of open open-hearted sophistication, finding out who these people are and how they lived, um, and even eventually trying to change their lives, to change history by saving their lives. Which of course she fails, and she can't even save her father's life. Um, so I think that's a major theme. If we can speak of themes, I'm not fond of them, but that's something that runs through the book. And there are certain things that these characters say at different times that pretty much are almost that you know that heavy in terms of the thematics. But they're profound people. So spending time with them, uh, I let them say it. I let them say it. I didn't have to make it up. I mean, some people have asked me, about the dialogue. How did you dare write dialogue for these these geniuses? Well, a lot of it's just paraphrased or lifted from their poems. It was easy to do, and I wasn't afraid uh, to do it. And that goes back again to say, okay, how would being an artist change you? Well, that don't don't be afraid. And so to do the same thing, to let it down, let yourself down, open up, and let it happen, and don't even let yourself get in the way. Don't just watch what you're doing, pay attention, and let it happen, and trust that it's in there. And as my brother, who's a painter, said, if he studied painting seriously for years, he said, "You don't paint with your head; you paint with your hands." And I there's okay, brother. So and that, of course, then that's what he has to do too, right? And when he's a painting, he's an abstract painter. He has to let things drop away and have faith in color and dimension and juxtaposition, and that's similarly right. That's creative. That's creativity, and that's kind of how I try to see the novel. In this novel in particular, it did it. It did it on its own. I thought about it a lot, but I did it. It
Tremendous.
did it on its own.
Tremendous. So, last question, Dr. Rosenthal. And again, thank you so much for your gift. And for anyone who is listening, really go now and buy a copy on Walton Well Press and buy the book Awake Forever in a
Because
Sweet
my manager would
Unrest.
want me to show you. Put the book. Okay, there it is.
Beautiful. And tell me lastly what for you true looks like and beauty.
It's in front of your face. It's really very simple. Just look what's in front of you. I mean, I know there's horrors out there. I know that there's some horrible wars, and possibly facing a disaster as I sit here. But it's uh, it's there. They're not things. You can't just grab them. And get them. There's it's your ability to look at what's in front of you. Who is it? Tennyson with the flower, or Whitman with leaves of grass. Um, the miracles are happening all the time. Even on this level of reality, as boring as it is, it's happening, and try to have those moments where you're sensitive to it, because life is troubling and busy. Uh, but so I guess what I think artists are capable of doing is you have to step away from that, and in some way that was an action of this book for me, because of the pandemic and war in Europe and war in the Middle East, and this was not about those things. This was looking for other ways, another way to step away, at least for a moment, into uh, something that's beautiful and true, I guess, right? Uh, but they aren't banners. I'm not flying flags of truth and beauty. But I think it's out there. It's out there.
Lastly, what makes you feel alive?
Oh, what makes me feel alive? Well, you know, it was I was an athlete, and in those days, uh, it was being able to hit a topspin backhand, or briefly dunk a basketball, or I mean those, and as I got older, the feeling alive was being on my horse and accomplishing things together. Amazing experience. So now I'm older. There's less I can do physically to feel alive. So it comes about in reading and writing and being in love, um, and and also I found with this book, if one person coming up to me and saying, "Wow, that's a beautiful book. I love that book." That makes me feel alive. That makes me feel good. You know, um, so it's not so visceral now. I'm an older man, and I've got to be more accepting. Okay. I'm not gonna cross Canada on my motorcycle.
Dr. Chuck Rosenthal, thank you so much for truly a gift to me and really to the world. Anyone who is listening or watching this, please buy a copy of Awake Forever in a Sweet Unrest. Thank you so much, Dr. Chuck Rosenthal, for being on the show.
Thank you, and you're certainly welcome. All
Dr.
right.
Chuck
Take care.
Rosenthal. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.